All right, so while more people are coming in, I'm going to get us started. Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Locker, and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program with author Dan Slater on the Incorruptibles, Kingpins, Crime Busters, and the Birth of the American Underworld. It's a very fun title. We're going to have a Q&A at the very end, so please feel free to continue throughout the program to put your questions in the chat. For our Q&A, if you'd prefer to ask out loud, you'll also have that opportunity at the end of the program as well. For those of you who haven't visited us before, the museum at Eldridge Street is housed in the historic Eldridge Street Synagogue. Built in 1887, it was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews in the US, and it was nearly lost to neglect in the mid-20th century before the museum's massive restoration project restored the space to its former glory and for public use. We offer both virtual programs and in-person programs at Eldridge Street, all about immigrant life on the Lower East Side, architecture, historic preservation, and you can find all of our public programming listed on our website at eldridgestreet.org/events. I'll put the link in the chat after this intro. If you're local or you'll be visiting the city, please pay special attention to our walking tours coming up. We have a lot of great offerings coming up, from our signature Lower East Side walking tours to a special tour of the Bowery, and you can see maybe some of the sites that Dan will speak about today. So that'll be really great after this program. If you're not local, don't worry. We have some virtual programs coming up after this one as well, including a virtual program on October 1st at 6 p.m. with acclaimed artist Toby Kahn in honor of Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And it's all about his Rosh Hashanah Judaica that he has in his exhibition that's currently on display at the museum. So be sure to register for that and to see his show before it closes in November. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker this evening. Dan Slater is the author of Wolf Boys, which was a Chicago Public Library Best Book of the Year, Love in the Time of Algorithms, and The Officer and the Entrepreneur. A graduate of Colgate University, New York Film Academy, and Brooklyn Law School, he's written for more than a dozen publications, including The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The New York Times, New York Magazine, The Boston Globe, The Atlantic, Texas Monthly, New Yorker Online, and GQ. Raised in Minnesota, Slater lives in New England with his wife and their two sons. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Dan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Maya. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, everyone, for being here. We're going to have somewhat of a weird subject tonight because I have a bunch of photographs to show, and Maya is going to be in control of the photos, but I'm going to give her sort of a nod when I want her to switch photos. So bear with us. But before I talk about my book, I do want to say a word about the photography that I'm going to show tonight. I did not pull these photos off the web. I didn't find them in a library. In fact, many of them have never been published. And of those that have been published, they would have appeared in a newspaper or a magazine more than a century ago. So here's where the photos are from. Back in 1904, there was a photo news service that began called Brown Brothers. It opened in New York, and it was the nation's first stock photography agency. It employed a small team of photographers who went around the city shooting anything of interest. Maya, you can go to the first image. They did, life on the Lower East Side. This is Catherine Street and Cherry Street. Maya, if you go to the next one, you see some shoeless children eating what I believe is a knish. They shot immigrants in Ellis Island. Maya, if you go to the next one, you see boys sharing their first cigarette. You see the lunch wagon at Ellis Island in the next one. The photographers shot athletic events, celebrities. They shot the 6-day bicycle race. Maya, if you go to the next one, the 6-day bicycle race was one of the most popular sports of the time, even though it's largely forgotten today. In fact, it pulled larger audiences than baseball did. And they shot all kinds of things. They shot opium dens. Maya, if you go to the next shot, you'll see an opium den. They shot saloons. Maya, if you go to the next one, you'll see a saloon on the Lower East Side. You'll see the Yiddish there on the billboard to the right. And so they shot all kinds of things. And Brown Brothers operated for decades. And then it shut down, I believe, in the 1950s. And when it shut down, it had hundreds of thousands of images that it had accumulated, and they all went into a warehouse where they sat and remained untouched until just a few years ago. In the summer of 2020, the owner of the archive struck a deal with an auction house in New Jersey, which purchased the whole thing with the plan of selling the archive off image by image on eBay. At that time, the summer of 2020, I'd been working on my book for a couple years. And the book, which I'm going to get to in just a moment, is a true story about the Lower East Side underworld and the secretive efforts by some wealthy uptowners to eradicate it. So, to exhume the story that I tell in the book, I drew from materials like trial transcripts, newspapers, memoirs, oral histories. But I was always eager to know what the people and the places and the events I was writing about actually looked like, the kind of tactile information that can bring a story alive. So occasionally I would go onto eBay and search for vintage materials from pre-World War I New York, photos, pamphlets, anything I could find. There wasn't much, but one day I stumbled on these weekly auctions of the Brown Brothers archive, and suddenly it was an amazing experience. It was just phenomenal luck. I found myself looking at loads of never before seen photos of the very world that I was trying to build in the Incorruptibles. So over the next few years, I purchased several hundred photos from the archive. About 70 of them or so made their way into the book. And tonight I'll be sharing a lot of images that appear in the book, as well as many that do not. So first of all, a big thank you to Maya Locker and the Museum at Eldridge Street for hosting me. From a historical standpoint, the Eldridge Street Synagogue is one of the most important remaining institutions on the Lower East Side. The synagogue went up in 1887 and is said to have been the first major synagogue built by the Eastern European refugees who were then beginning to flood into the neighborhood. At that time, the 1880s, the Eastern European presence was still relatively small. Over the next 20 years or so, that would change as the situation for Jews in Eastern Europe got worse and worse. By 1907, the Lower East Side was the most crowded urban area in the world, with as many as 1,500 people living on a single square block. There were 16,000 East Siders, approximately for every acre of park space on the Lower East Side. Maya, can you go to the next shot there? This is sort of a familiar scene. This is a family sleeping outside on the stoop in summer. Maya, if you go to the next one, you'll see a family that is sleeping out in the fire escape, or the children are sleeping while the parents are fanning themselves. Maya, if you go to the next shot, you will see boys in a bread line on 2nd Avenue. And we'll get to the bread lines in a moment. With the development of this ghetto came the development of what was probably the most vast and complex underworld on the planet. There was a lot of crime. There was theft, there was prostitution, there was gambling, there was drugs, there was murder for hire. Maya, if you go to the next photo, you will see an addict preparing a shot. And if you go to the next photo, you will see a murdered garment manufacturer. This is somebody who failed to heed the demands of the Jewish labor unions and paid the ultimate price. There were also lots of gangs, and the gangs didn't just fight each other. They were in the extortion business. There was a gang of Jewish horse poisoners, for instance. They called themselves the Yiddish Black Hand, and they made their money by extorting businesses that relied on horse transport, as many businesses of the day had to do. Maya, if you go to the next photo there, you will see a letter from the Yiddish horse poisoners. Uh, it says, I'll read a few lines. It says, Mr. Zausner, we are now ready to do business with you. We demand from you the sum of $300. And then it says the time and the place that he's supposed to drop the money off. At the end, it says, we are watching you all the time, so beware. If you fail to do as we ask you, we will poison your horses. Sincerely, the Yiddish Camorra. Um, it wasn't, and Maya, if you go to the next shot there, you will see the Yiddish horse poisoners. This was the gang, and if you go to the next photo, you will see what again was a familiar scene on the Lower East Side and really in all of the city, which is a horse being disposed of, being dragged off the street. This period of time was a horrible time for horses in the city. There were about 70,000 work horses in the city, and as the years moved on into the early 1900s and the automobile started to come of age, all these horses had to compete with cars and the streets. A lot of them weren't fed properly. The treatment was horrible, and so the last thing they needed was a bunch of horse poisoners running around. But that was the scene, and it wasn't just the amount of vice and crime that sort of impressed, but it was the extensive organization of it. In the Jewish underworld, each category of vice had a corresponding association. You had the casino owners, the pimps, they would each band together into these fraternities or these unions in order to network and do business and pool their power and their resources. Most memorably, there was an association of pimps called the Independent Benevolent Association, or the IBA, and they gathered at a cafe on Second Avenue. And their organization was extensive. They actually incorporated in Albany under New York state law. They had bylaws. They had a corporate constitution that spelled out, the unemployment benefits that they would get and the burial rights and everything. So not surprisingly, as the Lower East Side ghetto grew along with its reputation for vice, there was a big backlash from mainstream America, from people in the country who saw these new arrivals as a threat to America for Americans. The anti-immigration movement wanted to pass a law that would shut down the border. They wanted eugenics to play a role in deciding who could procreate. And if you were part of this nativist crowd, then the idea of Jewish crime was a wonderful validation for the policies you wanted to see enacted. And this sort of anti-immigration, anti-Semitic sentiment was not a minority viewpoint. Maya, can you go to the next photo, please? So this is a picture of the NYPD commissioner, the guy who ran the New York police force. His name is Theodore Bingham. And in 1908, Commissioner Bingham wrote an article in a popular magazine called the North American Review. The North American Review was founded by the same folks who founded the anti-immigration movement back in the 1890s. And Bingham's piece was entitled Foreign Criminals in New York. And in it, he blamed the crime problem in New York City on what he called Russian Hebrews. He said it should be no surprise that the people who were naturally unsuited for physical labor and who lacked language abilities should turn to poisoning horses and selling their daughters in the street. He wrote, and this is a quote, "They are burglars, firebugs, pickpockets, and highway robbers when they have the courage. But though all crime is their province, pocket picking is the one to which they seem to take most naturally." As you can imagine, this piece really stirred things up. Maya, can you go to the next photo, please? There were about a dozen Yiddish newspapers on the Lower East Side at the time. And here you have the papers were sold all over the city. They were mixed in with the mainstream papers. So here you have a newsstand. This is on the Lower East Side. I think that gentleman is buying a copy of the Forward. So all these Yiddish papers took different positions on what Bingham had said in this piece that sort of went viral. Some predictably said this is really anti-Semitic. Others said, well, he's sort of right. We've got a lot of crime here. Um, Others wondered if he really meant what he said. Maybe he just misspoken. Um, Bingham did later retract the statements. He said he based his comments on faulty data, but by then it didn't really matter because the anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish voice to which he gave permission became louder and louder in the following years, 1909, 1910, 1911. Maya, can you go to the next picture, please? So while all this was happening, there was another group of Jewish people in Manhattan who were watching this with horror. These were the German Jews, whose ancestors had arrived in America a generation or two before the Eastern Europeans. Back in Germany, they too had come from a long history of oppression, but they'd also come from a more enlightened background in Western Europe. And the German Jews, when they got here, they thrived famously. We know many of their names today because they adorn or they have adorned important institutions. Lehman, Solomon. Here we have their fancy synagogue, Temple Emmanuel, that was really a beautiful building on Fifth Avenue and I believe 42nd or 43rd Street. Um, these folks founded roughly half the firms on Wall Street. One family owned Macy's department store. Another family owned the New York Times. And Maya, if you go to the next photo, you will see sort of the most famous German Jewish uptowner, that is Jacob Schiff. He ran the second largest bank on Wall Street after JP Morgan's bank. And Schiff was known in the newspapers as the Jewish JP Morgan. So these German Jews had built a lot in America and they felt like they had a lot to lose. For one thing, they worried that these downtowners, the co-religionists who were newly arrived, would undermine their own hard-won social respectability. But it wasn't just self-interest. They were also idealists. They believed that an open border was what made America. They also believed in elevating their downtown brethren who were less fortunate. And they donated huge sums of money and built all kinds of philanthropic organizations, free education, free health care, orphanages. Maya, if you go to the next photo, you will see a bread line on the Bowery. If you go to the next photo, you will see another common scene, which was a matzah giveaway. These were happening all the time around Passover. Lots of matzah being given away on the Lower East Side. The German Jewish uptowners established public milk stations, handing out free pasteurized milk in order to assuage the typhoid problem. Maya, if you go to the next photo, you will see what one of the milk stations looked like. People could just walk in and get a bottle of pasteurized milk for like a penny, or sometimes it was free. The uptowners built the Henry Street settlement, the University settlement on Eldridge Street, the Education Alliance on East Broadway, and many, many more really important institutions, some of which are still around today. Notably, all of this stuff that they built could have only been supplied with private money because there wasn't yet a welfare net in America. In fact, there wasn't even an income tax until 1913. And when the income tax started, it was like 1% or something. There were no labor laws either. There was no effective regulations of child labor or hours worked. There was no minimum wage. There was very little in the way of safety regulations. And East Siders, many of them young women, organized into labor unions and protested in the streets, which is a part of history that we hear about more often. So Maya, if you go to the next shot, you'll see shirtwaist strikers in the street. I love this photo because gosh, I love those faces, and the clothes they were wearing are just amazing. They knew how to make their own clothes because they all worked in garment factories. So they often dressed sort of above their station a bit. Maya, if you go to the next one, this is another photo that I really love. This is not from the Brown Brothers archive. This is a publicly available photo that you will see around. Again, extremely vivid shot. So downtown crime, meanwhile, was something that irked the uptowners for years. Uh, it was harder to talk about because they wanted to talk about elevation of the downtowners. They didn't want to talk about the negative aspects. During the first decade of the 1900s, some uptowners had been involved in kind of secretive attempts to eradicate vice on the Lower East Side, but those attempts often blew back in their face. But now, 1908, 1909, with the police commissioner writing articles and the subject of Jewish vice being a constant feature of newspaper headlines, it was getting to the point where it could no longer be ignored. And then by the summer of 1912, it got to the point where it could really no longer be ignored. Maya, can you go to the next shot, please? It was that summer, the summer of 1912, that a notorious Jewish gambler and casino owner named Herman Rosenthal was murdered outside of a hotel in Times Square. Maya, can you go to the next shot, please? Here we are up in Times Square. You'll see in the center of this image the Metropole Hotel, which was a famous hotel at the time. That's on 43rd Street. And Herman Rosenthal was shot after midnight, I believe July 15th or 16th. And the folks implicated in that murder were all Lower East Side immigrants, plus one cop in the NYPD who was charged with having ordered the murder. So all the unique circumstances of this case would make the story front page news nationally and abroad as well for the next several years. It became the sort of, as it was called, the Rosenthal affair, became the most obsessed over murder case of its time. And in the wake of that murder, the uptowners decided that they needed to take real action. So it is this background against which the story told in the Incorruptibles takes place. But what attracted me to this world, to this time and the place, because everything I've just described, I didn't learn any of it until later. For me, writing projects don't begin really with the context or an issue. They often begin with a sort of fascination in a world that is in some way hidden, and that was certainly the case here. But a project doesn't really get rolling until a person appears, a person who represents that world and can kind of take us into it. So I want to wrap up by telling the story of how I found that person and who he was. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was working. Actually, Maya, you can go one more. We can just look at Times Square there before I get into this. So that was another shot of, that's 42nd Street. That's what Times Square looked like at night. These gigantic billboards and everything. It was the first time really that the city was becoming illuminated. But back to how I got to the Incorruptibles. About 6 or 7 years ago, I was working on a story that was not a historical story. It was a contemporary story about a gang of violent rabbis in the Orthodox community. And for decades, these rabbis had been beating up husbands who refused to give their wives a religious divorce. As some of you might know, in the Orthodox Jewish culture, a woman cannot simply go to a secular court, file for divorce, and leave a marriage. If she wants to remain in the culture, get remarried, and have future children who will be considered Jewish by the standards of the community, she needs her husband to give her something called a get, which is the biblically mandated bill of divorce. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, there's a portion of men who refuse the get and use the get for nefarious purposes. They want to torment the wife, or they want to use, withholding the get to extort money from the wife's family. So this gang of rabbis had kind of anointed themselves judge and jury on this issue. And when they felt that a certain husband was refusing the get unjustly, they would pull him into the back of a van, perhaps break a few ribs. It was known that they would take a cattle prod to his private parts on occasion, anything in order to get him to sign the document. These rabbis had operated with impunity for decades until the FBI got wind of what was happening, and an undercover agent, a female undercover agent, posing as an Orthodox wife in need of these rabbis' service, infiltrated the rabbi ring. As I researched that story, which became a magazine piece that published in 2019, I read up on the history of Jewish crime and violence. And in that reading, I returned often to New York in the early 1900s. In the background of the books I was reading was this kind of shadowy figure. Some historians referred to him as a writer or an investigator. He was a very young man who'd written thousands of pages about the Jewish underworld of pre-World War I New York. His name was Abe Schoenfeld. And Maya, if you go to the next picture, you will see Abe. One historian called Abe Schoenfeld a private detective. Another called him a student of the underworld. But it was a third characterization of Abe as a knowledgeable vigilante that really got my attention. It turned out that he was more than a mere observer of his world. He'd been enlisted in some kind of war on crime. And so I wondered, enlisted by whom and to what end? Those questions and many others sent me on a years-long research path that took me to public and private archives across the country and abroad. And what I found was that in the wake of the Rosenthal murder in the summer of 1912, the uptowners had approached Abe, who was then 21 years old, about leading a war on crime, or a vice crusade, as they were called in those days, on the Lower East Side. Maya, if you go to the next shot, please. Abe was raised in the Lower East Side. Here you will see a picture of his block of, that's the corner of Clinton Street and Delancey. His building is sort of to the right of the right side of that shot with the balconies on top. This was a picture that was taken in 1901 when he was about 10 years old. So some of those, like the clapboard buildings, would probably have been replaced in future years. But he was from the Lower East Side. And he had kind of been raised in the ghetto amongst the underworld in one way or another. Many of his friends had been sucked into the underworld. So he was not an uptowner with a political agenda. He was just a Lower East Side local who was ashamed of the state of his neighborhood. As a teen, he dropped out of school. He worked as a reformer who, in those years, provided research about the underworld to the uptowners. But now they wanted him for something else. They wanted him to play a leading role in eradicating vice on the Lower East Side. At first, by providing actionable intelligence about who was who and which of the cops and politicians were getting paid off in order to look the other way. So with the financial backing of the uptowners and the political backing of the city's mayor, Abe had some success in the first few months of this secretive vice crusade. And after that early success, the mayor decided to install Abe in the police department in the NYPD and give him a squad of 20 cops of his own choosing. Now, that was like an incredible amount of power to give to anyone, especially someone who was not a cop and really had nothing to do with the NYPD, let alone a 21-year-old. But that's what happened. And the group that he led became known as the Incorruptibles, which is the title of my book. And the Incorruptibles encompass not just the cops in his vice squad, but it was also, he had a huge ring of informants in the underworld, in pretty much every aspect of the underworld. These were people that he'd known for a long time, had long relationships with, people who fed him a lot of information. And as the German Jewish uptowners were backing him financially and kind of giving him as much money as he asked for, he was able to build that up. He had so much money to pay out to informants. So by the time he gets into the police department, he has access to a lot of information. And so in the next year or so, throughout 1913 and into 1914, these vice crusaders led by Abe made their way through the underworld, confronting phase after phase of it. They arrested drug dealers and shut down pharmacies that were selling the stuff in violation of the new anti-drug laws. Maya, if you go to the next picture, you'll see the original NYPD headquarters on Center Street, big building. And Maya, if you go to the next shot, you will see the narcotics room of the NYPD. As the drug wars began, they would, set up these kind of museums so cops could come in and see what all the drugs look like that they were supposed to be taken off the streets. And those little sort of accordion pieces of paper on top of the cases, though that is referred to as the rogues gallery. Those were photographs of drug dealers, supposedly. So they arrested pickpockets, fences, and they often went after the cops who allowed those folks to operate as well. They shut down seedy dive resorts on the Lower East Side, from saloons to even some movie theaters that had essentially been turned into brothels, if you can imagine that. And eventually, they went after the gangs as well. As I researched and wrote my book, many other figures would enter the fray and become part of the story. But Abe and this vice crusade remained the narrative spine of the book. It was Abe's story that got me into this project. And I hope it gets you into the book as well. So that's the gist of it. And I'm happy to answer anything you may want to ask.
Thank you so much, Dan. I have a few questions in the chat and a few questions in my DMs. I would encourage everyone to please put your questions in the chat, or if you would like, I will enable folks to unmute at the end and you can ask your questions out loud. So starting out, first of all, I want to echo what this person just said in the chat. The photos are absolutely gorgeous. Thank you so much for showing them to us. I know you mentioned that a lot of them were photos that you've purchased on eBay and various other outlets. How do you go about looking for those photos?
Yeah, so I had been on eBay so I started this project around 2018 maybe, and in the early going, I would periodically go onto eBay and just do searches, Lower East Side Underworld, and just see, because there are dealers who deal in this stuff, like ephemera, pamphlets, and things like that. And of course, there's a lot of photographs of the Lower East Side, but after you've sort of combed the internet and combed the archives, you sort of get to the end of it. A lot of the photos that are out there get used again and again. But I would be on eBay periodically. I'd go on maybe once a week, once a month, do my searches, see if there was anything new that came up. And it was the summer of 2020. It was just super lucky. I was doing my searches and I ran into these auctions that were just beginning. So this auction house in New Jersey had purchased the Brown Brothers archive and block. I believe it was something like 7,000 boxes of photos that had been stored in a Pennsylvania warehouse for decades. And these photos, some of them were the original photographs themselves, like the prints. Others were the glass negatives. So the glass negatives are really amazing. They come in about 4 different sizes, from anywhere from 4 by 5 inches up to 8 by 10. And I would buy these. They'd come to my house, and I'd put them on my Epson scanner, and all of a sudden, this incredible image would show up on my computer, and so that became pretty addictive, especially when you're seeing, these images of like events and people from the story that you're working on. A story that I had thought was pretty obscure, like the Yiddish horse poisoners and things like that. And like, I had read trial transcripts about these people going on trial. I'd read some newspaper coverage, but to see the photograph, it's like confirmation that they really existed. So that's how I got the photos.
Amazing. And before I go to the next questions in the chat, I'm going to prompt Brad here to unmute because he actually leads our gangsters walking tour programs. So Brad, why don't you ask your question? I know you were excited for this.
Yeah, what? Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Again.
Okay, great. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
I gave your literary agent, Farley Chase, my gangster tour
Nice.
a few months ago because he was very interested. It seems that one of my son's friends knew him, and he was very anxious to go on the tour. And he appreciated
He's from the Lower East Side. He lives down
Yes,
there.
I know. I
Yeah.
know where he lives. I know where he is. He is, and he actually, and this is full disclosure, sent me a copy of your book, which I have read most of. And I just want to tell everybody that out of all the books I read, now remember I lead the gangster tour for the museum, and I for the Lower East Side Jewish Conservancy, and this is probably one of the best that I've read because it just tells it tells a story. It just doesn't give me facts. It's telling a story. And I would recommend this really to anybody. Of course, I was very, very familiar with the story. You have a lot more information than I put into my tour, which is a good thing. And I was just one of the questions that I wanted to ask. I was reading the other day about a conversation that Beansy Rosenthal had with Arnold Rothstein before Beansy Rosenthal, when he wanted to tell the cops about what was going on. And
so
Arnold
Beansy was the street name of Herman Rosenthal.
Right, it was Herman Rosenthal.
He was the gambler who was murdered outside of the Metropole Hotel, and it's the event that kind of incites the story that I'm telling in the book.
When you're there are conversations that you have in there, and my question is are you taking poetic license and creating those conversations?
No, those are conversations that are drawn from source material. So, for instance, the conversation that Arnold and Herman Rosenthal allegedly had shortly before Herman's demise was a conversation that was retold in a couple of places. One of them, importantly, was in Arnold Rothstein's wife's memoir.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, was she in the room when they had the conversation? Maybe. Was she in the room next door? Like, did Arnold tell her about it later? I mean, she recounts this conversation with a fair amount of confidence using, dialogue, quotations. So it comes from that, and it came from a couple of other sources that I would need to check the end notes. But to answer your question, no, I'm not inventing. But whether there is an author's note at the front of the book that sort of spells out the sources that I'm using, some of which are sources that like oral histories that are being made in some cases decades after the fact.
Right, right. So you
Um,
don't know
so
how valid they are, but
yeah,
they are
I
coming from
was
someplace.
using I kind of I gave myself license to use whatever I found. Um, because I
As
didn't
you
want to
should.
sit in judgment of the veracity of a 100-year-old source. That
Right,
said, most of the sources were things like trial transcripts where you had a participant getting up on the witness stand and recounting a story, their story, whether it was true or not, but something that was made more or less contemporaneously with the events they described.
right. You see the and the story of Judah Leon Magnus and Abe Schoenfeld and the Incorruptible. It is one of the main parts because I also talk about Big Jack Zelig and Siegel's Cafe, and that is one of the main stories that I have in my tour. And that's why when I started to read your stuff, which goes beyond the information that I have, I just thought it was fabulous. I really
Thank you,
did.
Brad.
And I
Thank
really
you. It means a
appreciate it.
lot to me.
I really do. I really do. So
Awesome.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brad. Oh, sorry, Dan, I accidentally muted you when I was going to mute Brad. You unmute yourself for a sec. Thank you. Um, I am, there you go. I am going to read some questions from the chat. We have a question from Mark who asks about the percentage of Jews on the Lower East Side who were involved in vice or crime. Were most just working hard to make good, or was a
Okay,
lot?
that's what I wanted to say.
There you go.
Yeah. I don't know. I would be reluctant to throw out like a percentage. My sense is that most were not involved in crime. I mean, to the extent that you go into any ghetto today, wherever in the country, you know, what's the percentage of people that are sort of on the wrong side of the law? 10% in a typical place? I don't know. But it's probably something like that. Um, but again, there was a lot of poverty and it was seductive. It was, the underworld was seductive in the same ways I think that it's seductive to today's youth.
Thank you. And we also have a question about Allen Street and the red light district underneath the elevated train line. Do you have any comments about that? Is that in your book?
Yes, Allen Street was an incredible place. So Abe Schoenfeld, when he went to PS20, he would walk past Allen Street every day. Allen Street was referred to as the gut, and I'm not sure what gut meant. Whether that was a Yiddish word or something, but it was the heart. It was the red light district, and there was a certain time in the early 1900s, around 1901, 1902, there was some research done about prostitution on the Lower East Side for the Committee of 15, which was an uptown organization that like commissioned a bunch of research about the underworld. And it was found that every address from like 1 Allen Street to 250 Allen Street contained at least one prostitute, if not a full-blown brothel. So that gives you a sense. I know. So the commenter mentions is there was an elevated that ran above Allen. Allen was also known, on top of everything else, as being a particularly narrow street. Everyone wanted to have Allen Street widened so that more sunlight could get through. So it was very dark, and it was the center of it was a center of prostitution. And when people came to New York, outsiders came to New York, everyone knew about Allen Street. And that is most definitely in the book.
And of course, once the elevated train line was taken down, Allen Street was widened and kind of tried to be made into this Lower East Side Broadway, which, if anyone's interested, come on our Lower East Side walking tours and hear more about that. Shameless plug. Um, some more comments. We have questions about the photos in the book. What photos are included in the book, and what did you do with the photos that didn't make it into the book?
Thank you for asking. So I was very fortunate because my publisher, Little Brown, knew what I had because I was very vocal about what I had, and I took every opportunity to show them the images I had. And so they gave me an incredible amount of space in the book for photographs. There are two 16-page photo sections in the book. So that's like 32 pages of photos, and there's like, I think 68 photos. And in fact, let me get a copy of the book. So you can see, like, this is page. This is the first page of the insert. You have an overhead shot of downtown Manhattan, which was taken probably from like Astor Place. You can see the Brooklyn Bridge. And then you have a photo that I showed in the presentation today, which is the Lower East Side. So they did a really good job. And yeah, so about, I think there's 65, 70 photos in the book. The rest of the images, I said I have a few hundred. I actually have about 700 images. And I would love to make a documentary based on the book using those images. Please, if you're interested in film and photography, I did make a book trailer that is on YouTube. If you just Google the Incorruptibles and YouTube or something, you will find that. I worked with a film editor friend of mine, and so that was kind of going to be like a teaser or a test reel for what a documentary might look like eventually. And after that, I would love to donate them to the right institution, someone who is set up to handle photography, especially the glass negatives, because they need to be stored in a particular way, which is, I learned I didn't know anything about this before, but the Smithsonian has certain guidelines for how a glass negative should be handled, and the kind of acid-free paper that you need to store it in, and the foam boxes that the acid paper goes in, and all of that. So I have it all set up, and eventually I would love to give it all to an institution of some kind.
And it's amazing that for the negatives, that's conceivably you're the first person to see them if you purchase the negatives.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in some instances, with some of the images, I have the original print and the glass negative. And again, this was a stock photography agency, so they operated similar to how one would operate today. They'd produce these photos, and then they would license them out to newspapers and magazines to use. And I think what would happen is they'd literally send the image by mail, and then the image would need to get sent back, and the newspaper or magazine had the right to use it a certain number of times, and all of that. So some of these photos were published, but my sense is that many of them were not, because some of them maybe just they weren't newsworthy enough, or there wasn't a place to put them. And I have all there were some subjects and subtopics that I just became interested in because they were kind of tangentially related to the story. I was very interested in the situation for women at the time, because first of all, we had the Lower East Side women, but just women in general were just beginning really to go to college, to go out into the workforce. And so I have some images of women buying like clothes for the office and the way that was marketed to them. I have images of women working in a graphic design studio for the first time, things like that. Obviously, anything related to the underworld, I was very interested in, but I don't know how many newspapers wanted to publish a picture of an opium den, and things like that. However, there was another really important source for me, which was newspapers.com. It seems super obvious, but it's just an incredible resource. I spend $70 a year to be a member of newspapers.com. It is the best $70 that I spend as a researcher. I believe it's owned by ancestry.com. I think Ancestry found that people would come to Ancestry to learn about their ancestors, and then they would want to search for these people in old newspapers. So Ancestry bought newspapers.com and put a bunch of money into it, and they continue to just scan in pretty much every existing newspaper in every library they can find. And so every week, every month, newspapers.com gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They keep adding newspapers, they keep adding years, and they have a great search engine. So I was able to find some of with some of the photos I bought. I was able to find them in a newspaper. The technology for printing a photo in a newspaper was terrible. So, like in some cases, when I found the newspaper on newspapers.com, this beautiful photo that I owned showed up as just like blobs of ink on the page. So, in that sense, yeah, I was probably the first person to see the actual the actual image. They weren't made to go on an Epson scanner in the year 2020 and be projected onto a Mac computer, but it really is extraordinary to see them now.
That's amazing. And I'm sure, especially the photos of women, going to the workplace for the first time, I know those will find a great home someday.
Yeah,
Um, 700 is pretty intense. But
yeah.
it's amazing that 60 to
I
70,
got a little carried away.
I think there's no such thing with that. But 60 to 70 books incredible. So I hope
Yeah.
folks, first of all, do you want to tell folks where they can get the book? I know if you go to the program, folks could find the links in there, but even after this program's over, do you want to let them know where it's being sold?
Yeah, so the book is available wherever books are sold, online and in stores. But I know that the wonderful bookstore P&T Knitwear, the Lower East Side bookstore that specializes in books about New York, is offering a discount to, I think, to people who attended this book talk. And they gave us a code, I think, right?
Yes, so
Do,
on
do
the
you,
program, in the program description, you can find that code. And even once the program's taken down, I'm going to send a reminder email to everybody who's registered. So I'll put that in that reminder email so everyone could get that. I think it's 10% off.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say about the photos is Maya already knows I'm terrible with technology. And at the moment, my wife, who's sort of like the chief technology officer of our family, is helping me build a website, which should go live like tomorrow or the next day. And that website is going to have a ton of photographs on it. So that is www.bydanslater.com. By Dan Slater is also my social media handle. So if you go there like next week, you can see dozens of images.
Awesome. I'll definitely
Yeah.
put that in the email as well so folks can remember that. And then we have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to read a few more questions I've got in my DMs here. The first is you mentioned Rosenthal before, and you also mentioned it with Brad. Why did you choose this as the first scene of your book?
That is a great question that gets down to really writing, editing. I didn't have that as the first scene originally. I started off with Arnold Rothstein's Boyhood was going to be the first chapter, and there was going to be no prologue. And I just felt I needed something a bit stronger to kick it off. And I also felt like that murder does incite the story. And it does create some mystery around the story because after we show the murder in the prologue, we're going to see Herman as a boy being friends with Arnold. And we're going to kind of wonder, well, we just saw Herman die. So why does he die and what is going to happen to him? So that was really just a story decision. But it was a decision that came relatively late in the writing process. I think my editor suggested it. And I said, that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, it was definitely very impactful. So thank you. Thank you, commenter, for asking that. We have another question about the if there is a common thread throughout the books that you write that you've noticed, or if it's really just whatever interests you most at that time.
The last 10 years, I've been doing these kinds of nonfiction crime stories. The last 4 stories I've done, books and articles, have all been in that space. My last book was called Wolf Boys. My last print book was called Wolf Boys. And that was about American teenagers in South Texas who become assassins for a big Mexican drug cartel. A story set in the drug war, the modern day drug war. And in some ways, I viewed the Incorruptibles as almost like a little bit of a prequel to Wolf Boys, because it takes us back to the period when all these anti-vice laws started to come into being. And when we talk about Abe Schoenfeld and this vice crusade that he led, that whole operation was really enabled by all these new anti-vice laws that came into being in the early 1900s. So I am interested in how crime, how law enforcement is used to marginalize certain communities. I did an ebook that came out in 2018 called The Officer and the Entrepreneur. And that was about how African American soldiers, returning veterans from the Middle East, are sort of lured into this big conspiracy by DEA agents posing as members of a drug cartel and looking to bust people. So, yeah, I'm attracted to that. It is commercial, conveniently. It's a way to have a career, but that alone I don't think is enough. I think that I just have a genuine interest in this. It also has to do with the fact that I went to law school. So I know how to read a trial transcript. If I need to interview lawyers, that feels very natural to me and stuff.
And did you interview any lawyers for this project?
For this project, no, I couldn't interview anybody. Actually, that's not totally true. Abe Schoenfeld's grandniece, whose name is Ellen, she is a female judge now in Northern California, and she inherited Abe's papers, all of his papers, and his extensive library, all of his books. She kept the books, and she eventually donated all the papers to what's the name of the organization on 16th Street, the American Jewish
Center for Jewish History?
Yes, right. So that's where Abe's archive is, and without if she hadn't done that, this book probably wouldn't exist, because that archive contained about 11 drafts of his memoir that conveniently covers the years that I'm writing about in the book.
Yeah, I think with Eldridge Street as well, the 1800s and the early 1900s seems like such a long time ago, but there are still sons, daughters, grandchildren who remember these people really well. And
Yeah.
it's amazing to think how the generations work, where we're not as far removed as it might seem from a lot of these events.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Although no current lawyers who tried the cases, I'm sure. But
No, there was a cop. Abe also had a grand nephew whose name is Stephen Mandel. He's still alive. He's probably in his 70s. And he was NYPD. He was a young cop in the 60s and 70s as Abe was getting older and living on Central Park South. And his grandnephew would, when he was on the night shift driving his patrol car around, he would stop in and see how Uncle Abe was doing. And fortunately, I got to talk to Stephen a lot, and he had some great stories to tell. So, and the other thing I was able to do was Abe did an interview with a Columbia University professor in 1965. Abe was 74 at the time, and this professor from Columbia sought him out. They did a 2-day interview that was recorded on quarter-inch audio tape, which was like a transitional technology of the 1960s. The tapes survived, but they were inaudible. And I took them, again, the Center for Jewish History allowed me to take the tapes to a sound house a few blocks away. And for $500, they were able to restore the audio. So I have like 6 hours of Abe himself talking about the events of, that are in the book.
Wow. I knew CJH did amazing restorative work, but I didn't think about audio restoration. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And we are coming up on the hour, so if there are any last minute questions, please put them in the chat. But if there aren't, I would like to end with one that I think is a good way to end. What surprised you most in your research?
I hadn't known about the history of Jewish vice as a result of being marginalized. I hadn't known about that history that goes all the way back to really the anti-money lending law that comes about in the 12th century. I hadn't known about that. I hadn't known that prior to 1945, if you would have said the word, if you would have said the ghetto or used that word, the only connotation it would have had would have been Jewish. Which to me, having been born in 1977, is amazing because today, if you say ghetto, who do you think of? You think of uh, Black people, brown people, maybe Native Americans. But I wouldn't have thought of Jewish people and the ghetto. And yet the Jews really invented the ghetto. Of course, the term goes back to Venice in the early 1500s. But this is stuff that I've only learned in the past few years. I had no idea.
Yeah, and I think the history of, the history is often with the origins is very European. So I think for us Americans, sometimes it could be we have a lot of different connotations with a lot of words that mean such different things in Europe. And I think that's also kind of a running thread with a lot of the history that we teach at Eldridge Street too, is like depending on where you're coming from, and we have guests from I don't know where we are now, I think 98 countries and counting. Everyone takes a different perspective to the history that they're witnessing and to the history that we're teaching. So I think it's really amazing that when folks are, reading your book and learning about this history, going to our programming, everyone's bringing their own perspective. And I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up tonight. I want to just thank you again for showing us these images. They were stunning, and I want to encourage everyone to go out and get the book. Again, I'm going to follow up this program with an email to everybody with links. I'll include that link to your website. Also, the discount code on PJ Knitwear. Please go to PJ Knitwear. It's a wonderful bookstore on the Lower East Side, and come down to the museum at Eldridge Street. We're on 12 Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Head to Chinatown, get some great food, and then come to the museum and see some great sights. I want to thank Dan so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for doing this with us, and thank you all for coming. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, Maya. Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.